Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Writers Toolshed. If you'd like to join our writing community on Discord and get access to fantasy writing classes and books on Patreon, check the links in the description. And if you don't want to miss any future episodes, be sure to follow or subscribe. And to support the show, leave a quick rating on Spotify or iTunes and share this episode on social media or with anyone who you think may be interested. Thank you very much for listening. Enjoy the show. Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Writers Toolshed. I'm your host, Richie Billing, and today I'm delighted to be joined by the award-winning writer and editor, Dan Coxon. Dan, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much for joining me. Very kindly giving up your time to share your wonderful wisdom on writing short stories. I got a taste of this wisdom at FantasyCon in October last year. And Dan, you were part of a brilliant panel, weren't you? Which was all about writing short stories. And I've made so many notes. I picked up so much.
It was a really
And
good panel, actually. It was one of the best ones I've been on, I think.
I think it was Andrew Hook was on it as well.
He was chairing it, yeah. Uh,
Yeah,
Alan Ashley was on it.
Alan Ashley, yeah. There's a really, what was the name? The lady from the publisher. She was like a slush reader, and it was really interesting.
Yes. Oh, I didn't
Yeah.
know her, so I can't remember what her name was. Um,
Well, we shall put the we'll try and dig it out the panel listings in the description anyway. But yeah, I learned so much, and based on everything that you they taught me in that panel, I went away and I've been writing loads of short stories, and I'm pleased to say finally got some of them new ones published. So that's the answer you done. Thank you very much.
that's exactly what we want to hear as well. Well, I mean, obviously, it forces us out of the market, but no, I mean, it's really nice. I think that's one of those things that the panels and things like this podcast as well are really good for. Is it's just hearing other people's experiences as much as anything else, because it means you can kind of take a shortcut to where you want to be because you can talk to somebody or listen to somebody who has already been where you are right now or where you want to be, and kind of learn from their mistakes before you get to it.
Yeah. Oh, I remember the name. It was Hesper Leverett.
That's right.
Hesper Leverett. I think she reads for Lunar Station Quarterly. Is it? Was that right?
Yes, something like that. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Good magazine to check out. But yeah, the reason why I wanted to ask you to come onto the show is because a lot of listeners they write short stories, and we've got a very busy Discord community, and there's a lot of people swapping stories all the time, and we have a really nice sort of space where people share the highs and lows of short story writing because there's a lot of rejections, and then every now and then you get the great news that you've got the a successful outcome. And people are always looking for ways to get those uh, interesting ideas that capture people's imaginations and help you stand out. But there's so many pitfalls as well. And we were talking just before we started recording when we got some of them. Um,
Yeah.
Before we
I mean,
get
I
into that,
think it's
though,
interesting you mentioned let me mention that because it's the first thing that I always do whenever I run a workshop or whenever I talk to kind of students or anything is talk about kind of the editor's side of things because I work as an editor as well as a writer, I kind of see both sides of it, and it is just the fact that the default is always no. I was literally on Blue Sky to talk about this the other day as well because we receive, I mean, the numbers that I we normally churn out is for like a couple of anthologies recently. I know someone that received over 400 submissions for one spot in an anthology. I also know someone who got 800 for four spots. Um, so, I mean, just the numbers are just stacked against you, and you're basically, as an editor, just saying no to everything because you have to. You can't say yes to everything because we just can't publish it all. So it is just no, 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 default no. And in order to be the one that doesn't get the no, gets the yes, it's not enough just to write a good story. It has to literally stand out and pop out somehow. Um, And I mean, obviously, there's more complex processes than that. Most editors go through like a long list, short list kind of process. So, in an ideal world, you want to get yourself onto a long list or a short list, and then at least you've got a chance because it's maybe like, 1 in 10 or something by that point. So,
Yeah,
slightly more reasonable odds.
yeah,
Um, but it is, I mean, yeah, I think it's a mysterious kind of alchemy, this sort of coming up with are both ideas and then actually the execution of the story to kind of come up with something which is unique, but also really good and really well told.
yeah.
I guess is the sweet spot.
So tell us what you done. How did you get into writing? What's your journey been like, and why do short stories appeal to you so much?
The journey's been a long one, it has to be said. I mean, I was literally remembering the other day, sitting down and writing really bad kind of pastiches of William S. Burroughs back when I was sort of a teenager. So it would have been, what, 30 years ago? And I remember writing, there was a competition at the local library for a horror story. And I think it was only about 2,000 words. And I remember writing it out by hand in a big lined exercise book. And I remember the story very clearly. I think only because I wrote it very early on in my kind of writing career, because it really wasn't very good and it was enormously derivative and it didn't even really make any sense. It was just like throwing in horror tropes just for the sake of it, to try and get some kind of like jump scare reaction, I guess. But yeah, I mean that was the early days. I had a couple of publishing successes back then, kind of my teenage years, um, of which I still have copies of at least one of them, I think, and I'm still kind of slightly proud of it. It's quite a good
Yeah,
story. So it wasn't all rubbish, but it just took a long time to work out what I was doing. Um, I veered away from genre for quite a long time as well. I was kind of trying to write much more literary fiction, trying to write kind of more of a literary novel as well for a while. And none of that, it didn't really work because it wasn't really me, if I'm honest. I've been around long enough now that I can come to the conclusion that actually I was trying to force myself into areas that I didn't naturally go to. Whereas if I just left my imagination to do what it wanted to do, it actually went to much more interesting places. But sometimes it's about that's almost kind of about self-knowledge as much as it is about, writing skill or writing advice. It's
yeah,
just reaching a point where you know what it is actually that you have to offer.
yeah.
Um,
You learn through trial and error, don't you? Like I
yeah.
suppose we kind of we do these things because you feel like it's the right, or you think it's the right thing to do, but when you try it out, it just doesn't feel like you say it doesn't feel right, and you don't enjoy it, and it feels like a chore.
And it's interesting. I mean, it still all was kind of mileage for me. So in terms of like learning the ropes and learning kind of writing skills and stuff, even if I was writing in a different genre or trying to write in different genres, um, it was still about learning what works for me and what doesn't work for me, and quite often what my own kind of own personal weaknesses and strengths are as a writer, and trying to play up to the strengths and try and iron out the weaknesses. And as
Yeah,
I've gone on, so I mean, now I work as a proofreader and editor, like not quite full time, it's more or less part time, but freelance for quite a wide variety of publishers. And because of that, I've now kind of learned the editing skills so that I can see my own weaknesses a bit better, and I actually am able to fix them a bit better. I always say to people that it's kind of like most people I talk to about this, they kind of nod and go, "Oh yeah, I do that as well." But it's like if I'd write a story. This is kind of like up until I kind of worked out what I was doing. I'd write a story and I'd read it and I'd kind of know that something was wrong.
yeah,
But I kind of think to myself, oh, I can kind of get away with it, or
yeah,
oh, it'd be a load of work to fix it. So I think maybe I just kind of fudge it a bit and let it stand. Uh, those are exactly the things you need to fix because it's like you are the closest person to that story in the entire world because you have written it. So if you can see them and they're bugging you, I absolutely guarantee other people are going to notice them and they're going to bug them a hell of a lot more. Um, so those are the things. It's learning to listen to that inner voice and say, okay, yeah, that's a bit off. That sentence isn't quite working, or that passage isn't working, or whatever. And say, okay, I do need to fix it. I need to go back. I need to do some more work on it.
yeah,
Um, and I had a friend in America for a while who was a writer, quite a successful writer, who his kind of motto was always do the work. do the work, do the work.
Yeah.
Go back, work at it some more. Um, and I kind of picked that up that it's like, yeah, you can always be doing more work on it. Um, that in itself can sometimes bring its own problem. I know people in the past who've got kind of stuck not publishing stuff because they're kind of never finished with anything, and they always feel that things are not good enough. But I think on the whole, most of us are in the other direction. Most of us are kind of like, we know there's things a bit wrong with that story I just wrote. We know it's like 2,000 words too long, and the main character doesn't really make sense, and and the ending's kind of unsatisfying. But we kind of try and kid ourselves that we can get away with it,
Yeah.
and we probably can't.
So have you always been drawn to short stories?
I think so in the first instance. I mean, I had multiple aborted novel attempts over the years. Um, I did write a really, really bad, like generic fantasy epic quest novel when I was, I don't know, I was about 16 or something, I think.
Nice.
Um, and I've actually still got it somewhere. I have it in a folder and I can't quite bear to look at it. I thought at some point I might dig it out and see what lessons there are to be learned. I suspect what the case with it is it's probably very competently written, but really derivative and obvious and probably not of much interest to anybody, I suspect. Um, but I mean, getting published as a novelist is so much harder than getting published as a short story writer as well. So I kind of feel like with short stories, yeah, you're never going to get like the massive sales that novelists get, but you do kind of get lots of little kind of confidence boosts and affirmations along the way
Yeah.
um, that can kind of boost the confidence and keep you writing. Whereas I think I always have like some incredible respect and awe for these writers who just like out of the gate just sit down and write like 120,000 word novel and spend like 2 or 3 years doing it with like no prospect of getting published.
Yeah.
I'm like that. You've got to have quite a bit of kind of self-confidence to
Oh, I
back
know.
yourself to do that.
I've just done that for like the last 2 or 3 years. Just writing a novel and tried getting an agent with it, got absolutely nowhere with that. So I'm going back and editing it now, but I just got so fed up of committing yourself to that
It's really difficult.
long-term project
Yeah.
and I think it had been so long since I'd written a short story and gotten anything published that I almost forgot what it felt like to be a writer, like in terms of like having that confidence and belief that you can actually do it. Because it is like a barren time when you're writing a novel, a long piece like that. Um,
It is as well. I mean, I think it is as well. The fact that we're writing short stories, you can write it and it can go out there and be published somewhere, and someone can be reading it, and
yeah,
within not that long a period of time, in the greater scheme of things, maybe within months of you having written it, someone could be out there reading it. And for any writer and any piece of writing, I kind of always feel like it's not really complete until somebody's read it. Um, Otherwise, you are just kind of
yeah.
journaling in a rather weird way. Um, so it is that kind of, but it's like you get that kind of not necessarily that feedback, but it's that sense that it's out there in the world and then it has a life of its own. It almost sounds like having children or something, but it's it
It
is that
feels
sense
like
that it's
that.
kind of out there and it has a life like separate from you out there in the world.
Yeah.
Um,
You're
to me,
connected with
feels
other
like it's,
people.
it's quite a big thing.
Yeah, you're creating something that someone else is connected with, and that's why you do it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah,
and I
to
just
give other people some pleasure and entertainment, or just a little bit of an escape. It's amazing.
and I think as well. I mean, I love short stories, and I always have read a lot of short stories. Which is interesting because we're always told over and over again that short stories don't sell. That all the big publishers kind of will turn their nose up at any kind of short story collection, and quite often anthologies as well. Although I do edit those for a couple of kind of medium publishers, and but yeah, there's always this kind of you always get fed the line that short stories don't sell. They don't sell in the way that novels do. But there are a lot of us who really, really love reading short stories, and I always gravitate towards like interesting looking new short story collections,
Yeah,
especially if they're writers who know what they're doing with short stories. So they're either specialists in the short story or they whatever have kind of like shown their short story skills over the years. I find it really fascinating to read them. Partly because you get lots of different snapshots,
yeah,
especially if it's a single author collection of short stories. you kind of get lots of like little bursts from their mind instead of just getting this one kind of big panoramic vision. You get
Yeah,
like lots of little kind of shorts that just kind of show you lots of different facets of kind of where their brain's at and how they think. And
yeah. It's like looking at a starry sky rather than the moon.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I think that's
Um,
a nice point to sort of ask you this question is like, how would you define a short story? Because I think we said before, again just before we were talking, that, like a lot of people set out to write them without really having read them and not much of an idea or understanding of what it actually is.
Yeah, I mean, I do think for a lot of people, it's just it's an entry point because it's easy to sit down and write a short story. Whereas, as we just said, I mean, sitting down and writing a big full-length novel is difficult. It's a major commitment. Whereas, I could sit down tomorrow and write a new short story, and it could be pretty much finished in the course of a day. So when you're starting out, I think it seems like it's a good idea and a nice, easy way in. But I think because of that, a lot of people start writing short stories without having read very many. So what they actually think is a short story is quite often more of just a character study or a single scene from something that potentially could be a novel or at least a longer work of some kind. And because of that, as a short story, it's quite often quite kind of unsatisfying. And the pacing is quite often wrong as well. You'll find if people are writing in that kind of way, they're thinking more of kind of novel pacing, where you kind of ease things in, you have time to kind of describe who the character is and what they're doing and stuff before anything really happens. But you've not got that time in a short story.
Yeah.
In a short story, it really does need to just cut straight to your point and what you're about. Um, and I think it's probably the biggest single mistake I've seen in people who are kind of starting out with short story writing, is that they misinterpret to some extent what the short story does or can do. And so they end up doing that. They end up just writing like the opening to a novel or a scene from a novel. Or like I
Yeah.
said, sometimes even just a character study where nothing really happens. They're just kind of explaining who this character is. And those are all valid types of writing, and they absolutely have their place and can be really constructive in terms of building something longer, but they won't necessarily have a lot of success if they try and sell it as a short story. So if you're writing for yourself just to try a character out or see how a scene would work or whatever, that's brilliant, but you won't necessarily have a lot of success trying to find a home for it to get it published.
One of the biggest things that I always struggled with is like you say, just understanding the structure of the story and what it can be. And I think when I was at that panel, like you mentioned like a few different things, like to think of like moments or like standout moments or points in people's lives where they have to make decisions or points of change. I think when I started thinking about it like that, that really did help.
It is very much. I mean, it's very much getting to that crux of what that person, that character is about. Like I said, it's like jumping straight to like the meat of a novel. It's kind of like, if you think about novels in terms of scenes, which I think nowadays a lot of kind of the thinking on at least kind of creative writing end of it is in terms of thinking about it as like major scenes, and then you kind of stitch those major scenes together. The short story is almost like just jumping straight to your biggest major scene.
Yeah,
You almost don't want to be messing around with any of the rest of it, and you almost don't want to be messing around with the ending, because I think we might have said it on the panel actually that quite often the best short stories are the ones that do leave things a bit open at the end. I cannot remember where I read the quote or who it was that said it, but there is a quote somewhere about how the best kind of ending for a short story is it should reach some kind of ending, but then should kind of imply life going on beyond it. So you
yeah.
want there to be kind of a suggested implication that actually it's not an end. There is a whole life going on beyond it, and things are going to be different to how they were before the story. So something has changed. But what you're just focusing in on is that period where things change and when that person's life kind of skews off in a different direction or whatever.
So
Um,
to me, that's where it all clicks and makes sense when you explain it like that. Yeah, it's
But it sounds
very.
exciting as well, doesn't
It
it?
does,
That's the
yeah.
other
It's
thing.
like these
It's
the
like I
vital
would want to read
moments. But
that.
if you were talking to a person, like to be honest, when you're talking to anyone new, they're the kind of things that you want to get to really, because they're the most interesting things in that person's life potentially. They're maybe the most defining things, or the like you say, the crux point on which their life has changed direction.
I mean, I love
Uh,
so a lot of what I write is kind of within what's generally considered to be either the weird or the uncanny, depending which kind of school you prefer and where you're coming from, and probably depending on which story I've written as well. But I mean, I feel with those quite often that crux point is a very specific thing because it's the point where the main character, whoever they may be, suddenly realizes that the world isn't what they thought it was.
yeah,
That they thought the world was one way and that this was how the world worked. And actually, they reach this crux point in their life where something really strange and weird has happened that's completely unsettled them. And they kind of come to the realization that actually they had it all wrong and the world was not what they thought it was at all. And there's a certain level of kind of fear that comes out of that. So it does kind
yeah,
of play back into horror. But I did a really interesting panel with Jeremy Dyson, who wrote League of Gentlemen, um, well, a couple of years back now. And we ended up talking about it there and about how actually it's very similar to the way life is as a child. When you're a child, everything is weird and uncanny. It's
yeah,
like I remember one of my kids being like really amazed because we saw, what was it? We saw like a man and he had a beard, but his beard didn't meet up with his hair. There was like a gap between his beard and his hair. And to like a child, this was like mind blowing. It's like, what?
yeah,
His beard doesn't meet his hair. How could this possibly be? And I think they just go through that their life, our lives in these in our early years, where just like everything is like a realization about the world. We're constantly discovering new stuff about the world that we didn't know. And as you get older and become an adult, you kind of lose that a little bit. Generally speaking, most weeks are pretty much like the previous week, and it all kind of comes a bit same. So that kind of that feeling again, the kind of reigniting that feeling of the world being a bit strange and a bit weird, and actually maybe we've not understood everything about it, and there are whole things about the way the world works that we could just discover if we just, turn down the right street or the wrong street. Um, is really interesting. And that's with the weird and the uncanny, not all the time, but a lot of the time, that's kind of what it focuses in on is that point in the character's life where suddenly everything changes. And suddenly, like, however you want to put it, their eyes are opened or the
yeah.
veil is pulled away or whatever. It's that point. And that's why you
Nice.
get things like cosmic horror and stuff. I mean, cosmic horror kind of plays into that a huge amount as well, because that's all about suddenly realizing there are these ancient gods that are out there and
Yeah.
wish us all harm. And it's like again, it's pulling away that veil. It's like the everyday veil of the world is gone, and
That's
actually you're
what's,
seeing a completely different world.
yeah.
Or indeed,
That,
Trump's inauguration feels a bit like
yeah.
that.
Well, recording that on the very day. But we'll see where we are when this episode comes out. So you mentioned before about the pitfalls, and you said it's a good place to start, and I agree because there's a lot of ways people can go wrong. And you mentioned one before about writing something that isn't quite a short story, but you've, as an editor, have you come across any other common pitfalls that people make with short stories?
I mean, to be honest, again, this is where we had a discussion online the other day, and it started with a friend of mine who's editing an anthology, explaining why she was saying no to everybody. I think she felt bad about it. Um, but a lot of it is in that first kind of page or two. I mean, I know this gets hammered home every time, and people get very angry because they kind of say, "Well, why am I just being judged on the first page?" And it's like, well, because I'm looking at 400 manuscripts, and if I
Yeah,
don't like your first page, I don't have the time to fix everybody's first pages. I'm looking for one that I like from the get-go. Um, and so because of that, I think a lot of people start their story too soon. They start their story too early, and there's too much preamble. You get a lot of stories starting with kind of like somebody waking up in the morning,
yeah,
going downstairs, making themselves a cup of coffee, getting some breakfast. Oh, and then a letter comes, and oh, well, what's with this letter? And it's like we don't need all that preamble. If you need it as a writer, write it. By all means, write it. If that then gets you into that character's head and gets you to the right place. But the joy of working on laptops and things nowadays is it's very easy to cut things out. So you can just draw a line and cut that out, put it in a separate file so you don't lose it. And if you decide in the end that it was much better with it, you can always put it back in. But I would say 99% of the time, if you can cut as much as you can bear to bring yourself to cut from the beginning of a story, it is almost always stronger for it because you'll be starting right in the middle. of where the action happens. And I've actually done it myself, where I've cut that kind of section at the beginning. So maybe cut, say, a page at the beginning of a story. Because I kind of think, okay, I was just working it out in my head and getting into the character and getting into the situation. The reader doesn't need this. I'm just going to cut it. And then I've tried to put some of it back in kind of as a flashback later on. And I've actually found I didn't need it at all. It doesn't even need to go in as a flashback. It was just completely unnecessary information, but it was almost just like my brain getting up to speed when I sat down to write.
Yeah.
And it's actually quite a good piece of advice for breaking writer's block as well. Is just sit down and write, even if it's terrible and nothing is happening. And after a while, your brain just gets up to speed and you get into the character and into what's actually happening. And that's when it happens. But then cut. I mean, I'm an editor by trade, so I want to cut things all the time anyway. But yeah, I think, especially nowadays, now that we're not working on, typewriters with correction fluid and things anymore,
Yeah.
it
It's
is
the
very
best.
easy. Just keep different. I mean, I keep. I don't keep absolutely everything. I will cut some stuff completely, but certainly if I'm cutting whole kind of passages out, I'll keep them somewhere, or I'll keep earlier drafts. So I'll keep multiple drafts of a piece of work. Um, and then if I decide that I have absolutely just mucked it up, I can always revert back. I
Yeah.
never do. It's just a safety net. It just enables me to do all that stuff and do kind of slightly risky, daring things,
Yeah.
feeling there's that safety net there. But I never use it. I never go back to earlier drafts. It is just,
Yeah,
it's
I
a
agree. Yeah.
psychological thing. If they weren't there, I'd feel really anxious and concerned.
Yeah. You
Um,
usually take your best bits out. There might be like a sentence or a little phrase that you like, and you just keep that.
I mean, occasionally, and occasionally I've taken things out and then just used them somewhere else
Yeah.
because I liked it. It just didn't belong there in that story, so I've just used it somewhere else.
Nice.
Um, it does happen occasionally, and quite
Yeah.
often it happens, I find, with phrasing, and actually it kind of happens whether I want it to or not with phrasing. In that I find we all do this, um, is that you have certain phrases and certain images even
Yeah.
that are very personal to you and that you will use over and over and over again. Um, for some unknown reason, when I came to put my last collection together, um, it turned out if I wanted to have like a slightly posh character in any story, I always called him Miles. I had like four characters called Miles across all the stories.
Based on Miles Jupp.
Well, exactly. It was that kind of character. It was that, and it was like, it just, they were all kind of like, they were
Quintessential
slightly different
tough.
characters, but if he was slightly posh, then he was called Miles, and that was it. So I had to change all of those. But we have all these little quirks,
Yeah.
all of us do one way or another. So sometimes it's about you can kind of take something out and then actually realize you'll rewrite it in another story anyway because it's still there in your head. So it will just reappear by
Yeah.
itself.
So it's interesting that you say that this first page, obviously, I love them opening lines, and they are so like impressive when you get one that just grabs you straight away, gives you a bit of a intrigue and stuff like that. So what would you recommend? I mean, the hook is the arguably the most important part of the story. So what advice do you have to share on
In all
this?
honesty, I mean, it's like we all want to be surprised. We all want to have something that's just going to kind of like make us open our eyes and go, okay. But it's also got to make sense, is the problem.
Yeah.
And this is what I see a lot of people run into. I mean, I have seen it before where someone's come up with a really interesting, not even first line, but maybe like first kind of paragraph or two. And it's really interesting. And then it just immediately lapses back into what we were talking about earlier. And it's like, oh, then they go downstairs and make themselves a cup of coffee and get some breakfast.
Yeah.
And it's like, you can't just do that opening. You've got to then sustain it and it's got to go somewhere almost immediately afterwards. And there is a complaint, certainly, and I think it is actually fairly valid complaint because I've seen it quite a lot, um, which is that I actually think I think it came from TV series. So in America, as in particular, things like Netflix TV series, they very much need to prove themselves with a pilot episode. So they'll make a pilot episode, and then if the network thinks it's good, then they'll commission the entire series off the back of that pilot. Because of that, they have a tendency to throw everything into that pilot. It's like every
Yeah.
idea they've got, every joke they've got if it's a comedy, every bit of action if it's an action film, whatever. All of it goes into that pilot, and then they've got nowhere to go. And then
Yeah.
by like the middle of the first season, it's just kind of ground to a halt and everyone's a bit bored with it because actually they had nowhere else to go. They put it all in that first episode. But we seem to be copying it in the fiction world, and especially in novels, and especially in genre novels. That idea that the first chapter's got to be like blow your socks off,
Bam.
amazing.
Yeah.
It's got to throw everything at you, and then it has nowhere to go because you can't. You can't, in terms of like narrative arcs, then go up from there
Yeah.
because you've already started about as high as you're going to get. Um,
I don't know if
and
you remember watching that TV show, The Bodyguard.
I didn't. Oh no, I did
Oh,
actually. I did see
and it
that. Yes, I
started
do
off
remember
with
it.
a bomb threat on a train.
That's right. Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
honestly, it was one of the best opening 20 minutes of a TV show I've ever seen. And then you complete it right after that. It's good flat as anything afterwards.
Oh, that's literally about the only thing I remember from the entire show.
Exactly, yeah.
Is that Bob on the train? I mean, as far as I'm concerned, that was the program, I think.
I don't think there was anything to do with that bomb again after that.
No, I don't think it was. No, I think that was just them setting up the character and stuff. But it's
Yeah,
just, I mean, now you see these people do it in novels, and it's a real problem, I think, at the moment, because it's very much the preferred form. And if you are approaching publishers or approaching agents, quite often you're only sending them like the first chapter or three chapters or whatever it is they've asked for. So you basically need to do as much work as you can in that small sample, but then you still need to have somewhere to go afterwards. Um, and it's managing that trick that you've got to put everything in and yet still got to have more than everything to fill the
yeah,
rest of it up with. And you see people do it in short stories. I've seen it in short stories where people go all in on the kind of the first page or two, have it starting right in the middle of something really interesting and really exciting, and then it kind of dips and kind of sags in the middle where they're kind of treading water and kind of going, oh, I've got to get up to 4,000 words. So if I just do like 2,000 words in the middle of this happening, and then I can get to the exciting bit at the end again.
yeah,
Um, but in all honesty, short stories are weird in that they will be whatever length they want to be. And the more I work as an anthology editor, working with other writers, the more I find that the lengths of stories get away from people all the time. Even people that have been working, as writers for years and have multiple books under their belts, still they say, "Oh yeah, I'll write you a 4,000 word story," and then they'll come back like 2 months later and say, "Oh, I'm really sorry, it's like 8,500. It kind of got
yeah,
away from me." Or they come back and say, "Oh yeah, I kind of cut it back, and it's actually only like 1,500."
yeah,
But that's because each particular story, I think, needs to be as long as it needs to be. Um, and there's always, well, not always, but there's often stuff you can cut out to make it shorter. But equally, sometimes it just wants to be longer.
yeah.
It just wants to run and run, and you've got other ideas that you want to put into it, and other things you need to happen to get to that end point. And then by the time you get there, yeah, you've suddenly written a novella.
I know it is a tricky beast. I mean, it's quite weird. Like, as I've been getting more into short story writing, I've been like doing brainstorming sessions and writing plans off of stories and stuff, and thinking, I that one's about 2,500, that one's about 5,000, and because you kind of get an idea of what you need to write, what scenes you
Yes.
need to cover, and then I don't know. I suppose it comes with experience, doesn't it? You just get an idea of what it's gonna come out like at the ends, roughly.
It does. I mean, one of the things I did teach a workshop, whenever, like last year, I think, um, on kind of working an idea before you start writing it. Because we don't talk about it very much. A lot of the kind of workshops and the creative writing courses and things concentrate quite heavily on the actual act of writing, and they're putting their sentences down the page and how you structure things, and how you build character and all these kind of things. But actually, I think there's a lot to be said, especially for those of us who have quite busy lives, to kind of working an idea quite hard before you start writing it.
Yeah,
So rather than just having an idea and then just sitting down and writing it, actually fully interrogate that idea. And we worked on the workshop through a series of things whereby, like, the first thing you'd ask yourself is, well, have I seen this before somewhere? Is that the first idea that came into my head just because I've seen it elsewhere, either because it's a cliche or it's a trope or we've, seen something recently or read something recently that was a bit like that or whatever. And 9 times out of 10 it is. That's not a personal failing by any means. That's just the way our brains work, is that we
yeah,
draw on things that are familiar to us. So then you can have to kind of say, okay, well, in that case, I can't just do that because that's what we've seen before. And you have to start coming up with other ideas. And one of the things that, well, I kind of suggest to people is, in order to make ideas more personal and also more interesting as a reader, is bringing other elements in. Um, so I was working through this example with my 13-year-old on the way to school the other day because he was doing a piece of work. So the example I said was if you came up with an idea, is okay, I'm going to write a story about a boy wizard. Like now, obviously, a boy wizard's been done before,
Yeah.
and not even just by J.K. Rowling. Long before that, we was like, boy, who's a wizard? Um, so okay, well, what else could I put in? You kind of say, well, okay, well, I'm quite interested at the moment in what's going on with the International Space Station. So the International Space Station is actually going to be decommissioned, and they can be building a brand new top of the range kind of state of the art space station to replace it. It's like, okay, well, maybe we could, instead of being a wizard, it could be set in the future, and it's on that International Space Station because I'm really interested in that. And then you can kind of think and say, okay, well, maybe if I'm sitting on the space station instead, I'm actually really interested in sci-fi stories and stuff at the moment. So maybe we make it a near future sci-fi thing. And then maybe instead of being a magician, maybe he's got some kind of psychic power or something.
Yeah.
Like, okay, well, that's kind of interesting. And actually, well, I'm kind of interested in kind of like quantum entanglement and the way that kind of works at the moment. So maybe we can work that in somewhere that actually his kind of psychic ability or whatever that he has is somehow that he's quantum entangled with something somewhere and he's on the space station. And then suddenly you just take all these elements and put them in, and you've got an entirely different story, which A is hopefully slightly more original and less like that kind of trope that we're all used to. But also it ends up being very personal to you.
Yeah.
And I've done this multiple times, and you can do it with there's different aspects you can bring in. So you can bring in kind of different periods that you want to set things in. If you're interested in a particular period, you can have different writing, like different story styles. So they can do an epistolary novel. I did a novel that was told entirely through transcript, not a novel, a short story that was told entirely through transcripts of interviews with these band members of a band who had the lead singer who had gone missing. Um, and I actually did that as a cut-up technique. So I wrote them all. I wrote each interview out just
Yeah.
from beginning to end, basically in character. I then cut them all up and rearranged them and put them in different
That's
orders and stuff um,
that's really
until I
cool.
got it working. And it's just like, and then that one in particular as well is like I wanted to do that story, and I was also kind of obsessed with the really early days of the Seattle grunge scene because I lived in Seattle briefly.
Nice.
So I thought, well, okay, well, let's set it in the Seattle. This is a grunge band in early Seattle. We do this cut-up technique. I ended up writing lots of little bits and pieces in between some song lyrics to kind of dotting in between them and stuff as well. And then it becomes something else.
Yeah.
Whereas if I'd just written a straightforward story about a guy in a contemporary band who goes missing and his bandmates wonder where he's gone, it's less interesting and it's less personal.
Yeah.
And you're kind of doing two things at the same time, which is you're making it more original, but also I think you're investing yourself more emotionally in it. And I think as a writer, when you're emotionally invested in what you're writing, it shows. I think the reader can absolutely tell where something means something to you
Yeah.
personally.
I think
Um,
that's when you get that right as well. I think that's when it gets to like the special kind of realm. You feel like you've shared the experience, haven't you?
it is.
Uh,
And I think, I mean, that it is one of the things I love writing in general and not just short stories, is it is at its best, there's like a direct connection to someone else's imagination. I mean, you're literally forming pictures in your mind that hopefully are pretty close to the pictures they formed in their mind,
yeah,
which is a pretty incredible thing when you actually think about it.
definitely.
And if you can get the writing kind of sharp and good, then it should be fairly close to what it was that they were originally imagining.
Yeah. It's really interesting when you were describing that type of structure that you use, the epistolary and using like the transcripts. Because I
Yes.
think you said something very similar at FantasyCon, and I went off and I wrote a short story in the form of a to-do list.
Oh, yes, I do. Yeah, yeah.
Um, and I don't know, I think there was other examples on it. There was like one of like Amazon reviews.
Yeah,
Someone
yeah.
told a story through Amazon reviews. But there's all different ways you could tell that story, isn't it? And leave gaps for the reader to fill.
That was it. That was one of the exercises that I ran on the workshop originally. So yeah, it was getting people to come up with a story idea, and then yeah, you kind of just before you're about to do it, you drop in there. Okay, now you've got to write that as a list. It can be a list of anything. It could be a shopping list. It could be a list of instructions, like you say, Amazon reviews, whatever.
Yeah,
Um, but just write it as a list and just see what happens.
yeah.
Um, And
It was
that's one of
really
the
fun to
things that
learn.
I actually really like, and I encourage people to do as well. Is just is to do things to see what happens. It's like I've never written a story that's a transcript of tapes before. I've never done a cut up technique before. Well, let's do it. Let's do it and see what happens. It might be awful. It might not work at all.
Yeah,
Um, in fact, I had a novel manuscript that I couldn't land anywhere. And it was about 75,000 words. It kind of varied a little bit depending which draft I was using. But I thought, okay, it's not landed anywhere. I can't find a home for it at the moment. I'm going to like really cut it down. So I cut it down to 50,000. I cut a third of third of the
yeah,
wordage out. Cut it down from 75 down to 50 to see what happened. It's like, well, what does it look like if I do that to it?
yeah,
Uh, and actually, it turned out it was a lot better. I'm really much happier with it. I'm much more proud of it. The ending was still wrong, so I rewrote the ending. But I just the exercise of doing it,
yeah,
even if it still doesn't land anywhere, taught me things about myself as a writer
yeah,
and about the act of writing. So I kind of learned just general rules about writing and what works and what doesn't, and about being succinct and to the point and not giving too much backstory and all these kind of things. But at the same time, I learned things about myself and about what my strengths were and the places where I tend to go a bit off track and meander a bit. Um, I mean, I did cut a lot of backstory, and it turns out actually, again, like we were talking about drafts earlier, it's like I went back and looked at the longer draft, and I was like, yeah, I just didn't need any of that. I
yeah.
thought I did. I thought it was really important that we understood what had happened to this character and blah blah blah. But actually, we just needed to know that he'd lost his job, and that was it. It's almost like one sentence. He's lost his job.
That's all
We
you need
don't
to know.
need to know what that job was. We don't know why he lost it, or it was part of an economic downturn, and they were making cutbacks at the office and all this stuff. We don't need any of that. We just need to know he's lost his job. That's the only important thing to this story.
Yeah.
Um,
I was going to ask you because editing short stories, it can be tricky. I mean, the temptation is there when you're editing something short just to go through line by line. But as a professional editor, how would you recommend approaching the
I think the
process?
thing to do is to do multiple passes. I'm a massive fan of doing multiple passes and having them looking for something different every time. So do it by all means, just do a kind of big overall structure pass where you're like, okay, well, is the structure working? Let's just get quite a quick read. You don't need to be doing like very intricate read, quite a quick read over it, just see what's working, what isn't. But then you can do passes just to tighten up the language, tighten up the grammar, I quite often do a pass just to check for the things that I know I do badly, like putting in too much backstory, for example, like stuff that I know I'm pretty bad at. There's normally at least one pass that I do on a story that will be something specific to that story as well. Like,
Yeah,
for example, when I did the cut up technique one, I did do a pass to make sure that actually it did all still make sense and I wasn't mentioning things before they should have been mentioned and all this kind of stuff. Um, so all of that basically, and then probably still do another couple of passes at the end of it just to polish it and just. And one good piece of advice actually is I know people do it in different ways actually, but just kind of mixing it up so you're reading it or experiencing it in a slightly different way. So I know I tend to do a thing which I know some other writers do, which is putting it into a different font, which sounds ridiculous. But if you put it into a different font, maybe even a different size, slightly different size, or change the
yeah,
line spacing so it literally just looks different, you'll suddenly things will jump out at you that you didn't see first time round.
that's great.
But I know other people also use like programs that will read it out to you, so they can actually hear like a voice, albeit an AI generated voice, reading it to you, or reading it out loud yourself is another good way of doing it.
Yeah,
But it's just mixing up the way that you're approaching it and not just staring at the same text over and over again. There's suddenly stuff just jumps out.
yeah.
And like we said earlier as well, it's just like if you get a little bit of a feeling that if there's something that probably isn't right about it, then yeah, that's a big flag, and that probably needs fixing. And
Don't
listen to that
ignore it.
inner voice.
Don't ignore it. Uh, we've covered a lot about the writing side of it, and before we finish up, I was just going to ask you a little bit about the publishing side and
Yes.
the process. Where basically when you finish writing, you're getting it all ready to go out. Um, what would you recommend in terms of like cover letters? I mean, I know people spend ages on cover letters and probably unnecessarily so. But
I
how would
think, I
you
mean,
approach?
it is really funny in that I do find that editors, I mean, this is again from having been on both sides of the desk, so both submitting and having submissions, but I do find that editors sometimes have a very specific requirements of letters that are things
Yeah.
that I would never expect as an editor. So it never even occurred to me. Like for example, I don't like having knowing too much about the story. I would like to just experience the story. I don't want a summary of it in the letter
Yeah.
because I want to be able to just sit down and read it and experience what a reader is going to experience. Um, but I know some people like to have a summary. Generally speaking, I would say though, covering letters as short as possible, as you can bear to make them. We don't want too much information. It's normally so all of the information about the story up front. So in terms of what it's called, how long it is, whether it's been published anywhere else, if you're looking for a reprint, anything like that, that all goes right at the very beginning. So it's all quite kind of, immediately in the editor's eye line. It absolutely is worth putting a author biography in unless they ask you not to, um, because even if you think you haven't achieved very much, that in itself can sometimes be a selling point. Sometimes the fact that you are a new voice and a fresh-faced author is the selling point.
Yeah.
Um, so it's just worth letting them know just a little bit about who you are, just because they don't know you, they know nothing about you, and then just a thank you and sign off. Generally speaking,
Yeah.
I think I've seen some terribly, terribly long ones. And I've seen some that have gone completely off piece, and I've seen some that have tried almost like a really hardcore sales pitch technique. This is
Yeah.
going to be the best story you've ever read. Your mind's going to be blown when you read this. And it's like, okay, now you're setting that up. So if I'm not, my mind's not blown at the end of the first sentence, you just know it's going in
Yeah.
the no pile, don't you? I mean, it's like I think you've oversold that one a little bit. But we always used to get those. You'd get a few of those every submissions period.
Yeah.
Um, I really don't need it. You really don't need a hard sell. Most editors would just want to get to the story as soon as possible, but they just want to know what it is. They just want to know, what is this story? I mean, if you're submitting to somewhere that takes multiple genres, make sure you mentioned which genre it's in, or that kind of thing. And certainly in the biography, just anything that you think is relevant. So it doesn't need to be like a full CV. I have seen some before. I've literally seen a CV. I have been sent a CV in the past. So we don't need a CV. You just need any kind of relevant writing experience. And equally,
Yeah.
even if you don't have any, even if you've just gone to a couple of conventions or whatever, just say that. They just want to know who you are. Like I said, sometimes that is the selling point, because if they really like the story, it's like, great, I've discovered a new writer. This is brilliant.
Yeah. Exactly.
Everyone would
Yeah.
love to discover a new writer. So it's by no means a bad thing if you haven't got a lot of credits under your belt.
Yeah.
Just be upfront about it and just say, oh yeah, I'm just starting out, but I've had a couple of things. Really hope you like it.
Yeah. And what do you think about finding publishers? Where do you recommend people look for ideal
It's
places?
yeah, it's interesting. It depends what you want to do. You kind of have to be clear with yourself with like where you want things to end up. I mean, nowadays I don't write very many short stories because I just don't have time because I'm so busy editing things and stuff as well. So because of that, I only probably write 4 or 5 short stories in a year. Um, I'd kind of like them all to land sort of in anthologies or larger magazines.
Yeah.
So I tend to look out for anthology calls quite a lot, just because they feel slightly more permanent to me. But I mean, if you're
Yeah.
just wanting to get something out there, there's plenty of kind of like online fiction magazines and stuff as well that are absolutely fantastic and publishing great work. Um, my biggest thing that I've done, I mean, I've tried various things over the year to try and find markets. And in all honesty, I mean, we used to have a group of us who wrote very kind of similar fiction, used to have a spreadsheet that we'd share amongst us that would have like a list of markets, and then we kind of we didn't rank them as such, but we had like the top tier, middle tier, bottom tier. So
Yeah.
it was kind of the ones we really want to get into, the ones that's like, okay, yeah, we'd be happy to be there, and the ones that are like, okay, if I can't land anywhere else, that'd be kind of good, but
Yeah.
not quite so bothered. Um, and the problem I found was that it was so long between me writing stories. Every time I went back to it, like half of them had gone out of business.
Yeah.
It became obsolete very, very quickly. So actually joining things like Facebook groups or whatever social media you happen to use, almost every social media nowadays has some kind of groups function, and there are always groups for submission calls, and
Yeah.
quite often kind of genre by genre. So, if you write horror, find your horror submissions groups, and people will just post in there when they've got anthologies coming up, when they've got like magazine calls for submissions, or if they're starting a new magazine or whatever. And I find for me, that is much more helpful than like trawling through massive lists
Yeah.
on some database somewhere. Because apart from anything else, they quite often will give you specific submission guidelines. They give you some idea of what they're looking for. You get much more of a sense of what they are and what they're looking for, and it's very current. They're like literally want stories right now. They're sitting there saying, "We want you to send stories," instead of just kind of cold calling on people who might already have 800 stories sitting on their desk.
Definitely,
Um,
yeah. I've been using a platform called Chill Subs recently.
I've not used that
Um,
one. I've heard of it. Someone
yeah,
mentioned it in one of the workshops I ran.
yeah.
Um,
It's to be honest, it's I've been very impressed by it. I used to use Geotrope,
yes,
but
I
for
used
some
to use
reason
that.
I got banned from Geotrope. I just could never. I could try to make a login and it just would say, "Oh, you've been banned." So I was like, "Oh." But someone told me about
Crimes
Chill
against you a
Subs.
trope.
Yeah, God knows what I've done to them. But but Chill Subs is really good. It's like so they have different types of services. They've got a free one where you can just go on and you can filter down all your publishers and stuff by subgenre and word counts and all that. But they do have paid services as well. And one of the paid services, which I just did a little month trial of because I was quite interested in it, was someone who works for a publisher that they or an editor that they work with, reads your story and then selects 10 publishers that would be suitable
Okay.
to submit to. I just thought
Yeah,
that
yeah.
was I've never seen that service before, and I
No, I've
thought
not seen that.
that is quite cool. And I got the results back the other day, and they were really interesting and helpful. So I've sent it off to a few, and we'll see what happens.
That is interesting because that's actually something I've done for a university before. Is you go and talk to the creative writing students, and they give you a sample of their work and talk about the project they're working on. And then, yeah, the idea is you then give them some advice on kind of where actually they might feasibly send that and who might be interested in it. And I think it's always worth getting that more kind of specific feedback from someone who actually knows the scene and stuff. It's one of the reasons things like conventions are really good because you can go and you can see all these different publishers and what they're doing and the kind of stuff they're bringing out and hear them talk on panels. And you just get a flavor for what people are like and what people are looking for and that kind of stuff in a
Yeah,
way that I don't think you do just by trawling people's websites.
yeah, brilliant. Well, Dan, it's been absolutely fantastic chatting with you. Thank you very much for giving up your time. I know you're a busy guy, but it's I feel like I've learned loads, even more than what I learned at the panel. So thank you very much.
That's right. You're very welcome. I'm always happy to chat about it. And I suspect I'll be doing more panels in the near future as well. So
Yeah,
it's always
definitely.
good practice.
Yeah. Where's the best place to go to learn more about you and your books and your writing?
But I do have a website, which is just www.dancoxon.com. Um, I have to say I don't update it as often as I should do.
It's a shame.
Um, but there is I run a newsletter from that as well, which you can subscribe to on the website, which I do send that out about once a month that has details of anything new I've got coming out and stuff. Um,
Nice.
which is actually, when I first set it up, I thought there wasn't going to be anything on there, but actually it turns out every month I have something going on. So it is nice to be able to shout about events and stuff as well as, and podcasts,
Yeah.
as well as actual books and stuff.
If you get the chance as well, you're gonna have to go down and sit down at a panel. And also check out Writing the Uncanny, which award winning British Fantasy Award winning book.
Yeah, and still really proud of writing the Uncanny. I think it's really good. And writing the Future, the one after it, and and writing the Murders, the third one. Um,
Nice. Published
so
by
it's
The
turning
Link
into
as well, Liverpool-based publisher. So
yes, and
shout
nice
out to the
people.
hometown. Oh, well, thank you very much. Links for everything will be in the description. And thank you, everyone, for listening at home. Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Writers Toolshed. If you'd like to join our writing community on Discord and get access to fantasy writing classes and books on Patreon, check the links in the description. And if you don't want to miss any future episodes, be sure to follow or subscribe. And to support the show, leave a quick rating on Spotify or iTunes and share this episode on social media or with anyone who you think may be interested. Thank you very much for listening.